Our liberties are slowly being eroded away by the politically correct crowd. This podcast from the Australian Christian Lobby, or the ACL, is centered around that erosion. Here is Lyle Shelton from the ACL interviewing Martin Iles.
Welcome to Voice for Values with Lyle Shelton.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Voice for Values. It's great to have your company. Lyle Shelton's my name. I'm the Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby. This week we're going to be talking about freedoms, rights, and the pressure that's coming upon people who have beliefs, whether it's about marriage or beliefs that are perhaps a little bit politically incorrect, how there's legal pressure coming upon them. And joining me on the line to discuss this is Martin Iles. He's the Managing Director of a new group that you may or may not have heard of. It's called the Human Rights Law Alliance. Martin, welcome to Voice for Values.
G'day, Lyle. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Martin, it's great to have you. This is the second time we've had you on in this capacity, but since last time we talked about your new fledgling organisation, you've hit the media. You've had quite some exposure in the national press in the Australian.
Yeah, that's right, Lyle. We were in the Australian, which put up an article about the existence of us as a new legal clinic, particularly one that was focused on the area of law known as fundamental freedom. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, association, which is indeed exactly our focus, and also particularly the way that that need has arisen because existing human rights law clinics and indeed our own Human Rights Commission, which is the federal body, are not pursuing those rights with the same vigour as they are pursuing other rights, and there's adverse consequences to that.
So for a lot of people who are listening and who might have missed the first time we talked, your Human Rights Law Alliance is essentially a legal entity. It's like a clearinghouse to help people who are finding themselves in trouble with the law because they don't believe the right things from a political correctness point of view. Is that the simplest way to describe it?
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, it is a fact that there are people who may say things or may believe things or may indeed have organisations that are built around certain values which are increasingly becoming politically incorrect. There's a move on to silence those voices and to remove those organisations from polite society. Many people don't recognise that, but some people who have been in difficult situations with the law do, and we're here to help those people essentially.
So we're talking about people, and there's some real examples of this, unfortunately, which is why you've got this thing going so quickly. There are people who have been praying and peacefully protesting outside of abortion clinics, for instance, that have found themselves in legal hot water and even been arrested and facing court.
Yes, that's one example. So there's actually three of those cases at the moment, one in Tasmania, one in Victoria, and one in the ACT. All three of those people were arrested for doing certain things within what's called a buffer zone or a prescribed zone around an abortion clinic. One gentleman was protesting, one lady offered help to a woman who was approaching the clinic, and another gentleman prayed silently with his hands in his pockets outside the clinic. All three of those were charged with offences, and what we are saying in that situation is actually the laws at play that prevent that kind of conduct within the zones just don't balance the necessary rights and freedoms that exist. I mean, if you can't pray silently with your hands in your pocket in a particular place, or if you can't indeed offer someone help, and the woman, Kathy Clubb, who offered that help, is somebody who's been doing this for years, and she knows that many women actually accept it and that they are actually in a situation where they might need help, which is perfectly reasonable. And if she can't do that anymore as a basic act of kindness, well, the laws have gone way too far, and there's definite freedom of speech issues at play around that.
Massive freedom of speech issues. Who would have thought in modern Australia that these basic rights to disagree with a government policy, in this case the policy around abortion, would find someone getting arrested? Martin, I had the privilege just last week of meeting Kathy Clubb. She's a lovely lady, and she was telling a group of us how she and her work and those helping her have seen many, many babies' lives saved and mothers deliver healthy babies simply because they were there on hand outside of the abortion clinic to offer a different choice that was not being offered to the women who went inside those clinics.
Absolutely, and this is so important. The narrative built around these laws is that women are being harassed, being accosted, being all this kind of thing. That is not true. It is just not true. There's no evidence of that even happening. And in any case, existing laws are sufficient to deal with anybody that would engage in that kind of conduct. That is not, in fact, what has precipitated these laws. The people who introduced these laws knew that Kathy and others, called the Helpers of God's Precious Infants, were saving lives. And they've saved hundreds of lives over the last few years. And they've given real help, literally hundreds, and they've given real help to many women They've given them housing, safe havens, afterbirth support, all sorts of things. And that's what they've been doing. It's brilliant Christian work based in their religious freedom and their freedom of conscience, and that's what's being stopped.
And this is before we even talk about the most basic human right, and that is the right to life. That's another issue. But Martin, you have said, as you've talked about the establishment of the Human Rights Law Alliance, that there's a problem. It's not just around these issues of abortion and the buffer zones that we've just been talking about, but there's many other issues. You've said it's now very difficult for people to exist in polite society without falling foul of the law if they don't hold politically correct views on certain matters. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's any number of examples. Perhaps examples the best way to do it, but certainly as views become politically incorrect, it's interesting how laws that have always existed, in fact, become weaponized against them. So, for example, you've got the Archbishop Julian Porteous case, where he put out that booklet in Tasmania explaining the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage in a very gentle and respectful way. Now, there's a law in Tasmania that says you cannot offend somebody based on their sexual identity. Now, a transgender Greens candidate took Archbishop Julian Porteous to the Human Rights Commission over that booklet, saying that she was mortally offended by it. There's things like that whereby you have people who are simply expressing views that have been long held, that have, up until recently been totally uncontroversial, and are in themselves far from hateful or even far from offensive. They are simply part of the diversity that exists in a democratic society. And so those people are being pushed to the margins, and those views are being pushed to the margins. Other examples are people who work in places like counselling centres or in government departments, or we even had a gentleman who worked in a digital services agency. And these people, there's cases of these people being dismissed from their work because of the beliefs that they bring to their work. And we've had successful unfair dismissal cases off the back of that. So wow. You see how that as society's values change, there are certain people who are just not welcome. Now, freedom and tolerance and liberal democracy has always said that's fine. It's all right within certain margins for people to dissent. But there's a strange new ideology going on where actually dissent is not allowed. And we mustn't let that be reflected in our laws.
Absolutely. Hold that thought, Martin. We're coming up to a break. I'm with Martin Iles. He's the Managing Director of the Human Rights Law Alliance, a new body that's set up to protect human rights in the courts, rights that we once took for granted. Stick around. We'll be back right after this.
Voice for Values at acl.org.au.
Well, welcome back. I'm speaking with Martin Iles on Voice for Values Radio. It's great to have your company again this week. Before the break, Martin, we were talking about how people are coming under pressure in the workplace simply because they don't hold the right views. The obvious one is the views on marriage. If you don't support same-sex marriage, suddenly you're not accepted in polite society. But it even goes beyond that to the point where people are fearful of speaking up at work in certain occupations. It actually brings their very existence of their employment under pressure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you mentioned same-sex marriage. Actually, one of the cases we had was in relation to safe schools, somebody dissenting about the content of safe schools. Now, I would think that there's a great many very reasonable and ordinary Australians that have issues with the content of safe schools. This person said so at work after being challenged. They lost their job. So it really is getting a little out of hand.
That is very serious. And for those people who don't know what Safe Schools is, it's a controversial program that's been rolled out in over 500 schools around the country, which teaches children essentially that their gender is fluid and many, many other very extreme things, which we won't talk about today. But that's a worry that people have actually lost their job because of their view on the so-called Safe Schools program.
Absolutely. And it's not like it was a job with the Safe Schools Coalition. It was a job with a completely unrelated entity in that particular case. But, I mean, people also there's a lot of these wear it purple days, things like that, and you've got people in workplaces just feeling a bit marginalised.
So we need the Human Rights Law Alliance then so that if people encounter these problems, they can go to yourself and you can put them in touch with lawyers who can help defend them and ensure that they are able to keep their job and that we can keep the public space and the employment space free for there to be tolerance of different points of view.
Absolutely. And look, we've been criticised for, having sort of single issue agenda and not being a real human rights group because we're only into, freedom. That's not actually true. We believe in all of the rights and freedoms, including non-discrimination and things like that. It's just a simple fact, though, that the balance that's been struck presently is not right. The balance that's been struck between freedoms and other rights is not well articulated. It's not well described, and it's causing issues.
Now, you're not publicly funded, but there are a number of human rights law centres that do receive government money. And in essence, you have set up to, as you say, rebalance some of the work that these centres are doing, where our concept of what human rights are and what freedom is has been distorted. Can you just help us explain the difference between what you're doing and what these government-funded human rights law centres do?
Sure. So, I mean, I can't speak for all of them, but there is certainly an issue whereby the human right that is most legislated in Australia is the right to non-discrimination. And that's legislated uphill and down dale in every state and in 4 acts on a federal level. That is plenty of legislation on the subject. Unfortunately, there really aren't many other rights at all that are even acknowledged positively like that in Australian laws. And so what you have human rights now being viewed nearly exclusively through a prism or through a lens of non-discrimination. And so all of these clinics that are set up and a lot of the human rights lawyers that are out there are obsessed with all the various types of discrimination and vilification that's out there. And that's really their mainstay of their focus. Now, discrimination is not a good thing. However, when discrimination is asserted so much that it actually infringes on other fundamental rights and freedoms, it is a problem. Because whenever you overemphasize one right over others in human rights law, you always end up with issues and imbalance. And there is a serious imbalance. I mean, in the law, the international instruments that this stuff is drawn from, discrimination is much more finely balanced. It's targeted at acts that are severely unjust. It's targeted at acts that are arbitrary, that are unreasonable, and that take aim at people merely because of who they are. Now, the kind of discrimination that's being punished in Australian law just doesn't measure up to that standard. I mean, you have things like the Porteous case. You've got things like the QUT students in Brisbane. This is on a race issue where they made a silly comment online that, I mean, I can't understand how it's offensive, but nonetheless, they now could be fined $250,000 and all sorts of things. You've got this really terrible imbalance where people who are actually, innocently minded are being punished and silenced. That is not what discrimination was ever meant to achieve.
There's been some criticism, Martin, of HRLA since it went public, that the courts are not the place to fight for these human rights. That should be done in the Parliament. I think the former Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson said this publicly. He's now the member for Goldstein in the federal Parliament. What do you say to that?
Well, I agree and I disagree. I have to disagree because, I mean, if rights have been violated and there is a remedy available in the courts, of course you must take the remedy. You must go after it. And that's the situation we're in. We're fighting a sort of a rearguard action to say, look, the rights have been infringed. The policies don't protect people. So, we're going to help them out through the courts. On the flip side, Tim Wilson is right in the sense that rights should primarily be protected by parliaments. We totally agree with that. Policies and laws that are passed by parliaments should already protect human rights. We hope that is usually the case. However, there is remedial action that's necessary when Parliament gets it wrong or when unexpected issues arise. And I think, honestly, some of these things are unexpected issues. Some of these things have arisen as sort of downstream effects of, the proliferation of discrimination laws and things like that. So, he's right and yet he's wrong in the sense that we find ourselves in a position where what else can we do?
How do we get to a situation where we don't need organisations like you when, you can talk about going back to the good old days when there was freedom of speech and these anti-discrimination laws weren't out of control. What do we need to do to get back to sanity? I mean, obviously none of us want to see hate speech or inappropriate things being said of our fellow Australians, but there needs to be a better balance. How do we achieve that without having to go through litigation?
Well, I think the solution is cultural and legal. I think there's a cultural problem in that we don't disagree well anymore. And when we disagree on subjects, we tend to find ourselves at odds with the other person, not able to be their friend. And very often when there's this kind of disagreement, you also get legal action being taken, which is a relatively modern phenomenon in the sense that if I'm offended, I don't go and talk to you, I sue you. So there's a cultural problem in relation to that I really think we need to talk about. And I think it's partly exacerbated by the fact that people live in social media worlds of their own making now. They're in fishbowls. So when they encounter someone with different views, they really do think they're either wicked or ignorant. And that's not healthy. There's an unhealthy cultural issue. The other one is the legal. And I think that these situations show that there's a unfortunate balance that's taken place in laws that's out of kilter. And I do think that discrimination needs to be more carefully defined. And I do think that fundamental freedoms need to be more overtly acknowledged. And that's where we come in. So we're trying to mount cases where recognitions of fundamental freedoms are made. And we're trying to mount cases where, the actual limits, not just our ideological limits, but the actual limits of non-discrimination are more clearly spelled out. So there's legal and cultural solutions.
Well, it's important work, Martin, and sadly it's going to be needed for some time to help cause this cultural change. And your work in prosecuting some of this through the courts, I'm sure, is going to help society see that and come to its senses again. But in the meantime, it's important work, as I say, and must go on. So, Martin, thanks very much for sharing your time with us today on Voice for Values.
Thanks, Lyle. A great pleasure.
Voice for Values from the Australian Christian Lobby at acl.org.au.
Yes, it seems that if you do not agree with the movements that be, you are just to shut up. In fact, they have names for you. Here is a recent campaign speech given by Hillary Clinton calling out those who follow Donald Trump. Listen to the names she gives them.
You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that. And he has lifted them up.
Well, I'm sure that I would fit into one of those which Hillary named. No matter what Hillary's society or government say, I ought to obey God rather than men. Remember when the Lord visited Abraham on his way to judge Sodom? When the Lord was leaving, Abraham said that it would be far from the Lord to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Yes, the judge of all the earth will do right. And those of us who know him, who know God through faith in his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, ought to obey God rather than men.